Very much. Welcome, everybody. This session today is on how to implement a risk management process. And the agenda is to talk about a great concept, governance, risk, and compliance, GRC. I'm sure you've heard a lot about this. We'll talk about what exactly it is and what it may mean to you and your organization. We'll define risk and risk management. We'll identify the risk factors that may be meaningful to your organization. We'll identify the types of risk, and then we'll get an understanding of risk management models. There's three key models, and one is a very common one, the Enterprise Risk Management Model, ERM, the Deming Cycle, and ISO 31000 that was implemented in 2009. And then we'll actually learn how to implement a risk management process. Now, one thing I wanted to say before we get going is we're not going to really focus specifically on a type of company or industry, because you could have very many different risk type of requirements. Sarbanes-Oxley, of course, is going to apply to publicly traded companies, and any nonprofit types of organizations would have things like a Nonprofit Integrity Act, such as the state of California. Healthcare, of course, has their own types of risks that should be considered. So what we'll do is we'll really start with a very general look, and if you have any questions on any of the specifics that I just mentioned, we can certainly cover that in the Q&A session at the end. Okay, we'll talk about GRC. So GRC stands for Governance, Risk Management, and Compliance. And I wanted to start the presentation today to really focus on GRC, because this is really going to tie everything together as we get into some of the details. So GRC is basically the umbrella term covering an organization's approach across these three areas. They're very closely related. Governance, risk, compliance, and activities are really being integrated and aligned to the extent in order to avoid conflicts and duplication of efforts. And this is a really important concept, because many companies, particularly large organizations, could have different compliance efforts, different risk management efforts, and there's really no captain of the ship driving all the efforts that are needed for this type of requirement. So it encompasses activities such as corporate governance, enterprise risk management, and corporate compliance, which basically is how we really apply our efforts to its applicable laws and regulations. And as I mentioned, Sarbanes-Oxley, there could be other compliance regulations that your company needs to adhere to. So what's governance all about? Well, governance is really the overall management approach which senior executives direct and control the entire organization. It uses a combination of information and hierarchical management control structures. So it's not just the organization chart of your company or how you're structured. It's basically what are the activities that correspond with governance. So how does critical management information reach the executive team? Is it complete, accurate, and timely? And does it help management decision-making? And is management aware of the appropriate control mechanisms to ensure that strategies, instructions, directions are being carried out systematically and effectively? So it's really making sure that there's a structure for a company. It's going to include things like policies and procedures. It's going to make sure roles and responsibilities are clear. It could also include a series of meetings. For instance, how often does a CEO, the COO, CFO meet on a regular basis? And corporate governance, of course, for publicly traded companies or companies that have a board of directors would also include how often does a board meet and how is that meeting structured. Okay, the focus of today's topic, and also part of the GRC structure, is risk management. So risk management is really a series of processes through which management identifies, analyzes, and responds to the risk that could affect the realization of the organization's business objectives. And of course, it could impact the organization's adherence to compliance regulations. So the response to the risk depends on the perceived gravity, involves controlling, avoiding, accepting, or transferring the risk to a third party. And where organizations manage a wide range of risks, such as technological risks, commercial, financial risks, information security, external legal and regulatory risks are really the key issue in GRC. So again, regulatory compliance risks are the key issue within a GRC process. So it's also defined, risk management is also defined as the process of assessing risk, acting in a manner or prescribing policies and procedures such as to avoid or minimize the loss associated with the risk. So the risk management process itself is not a regulatory requirement, but it's an important focus for all types of organizations. So even though you may be adhering to regulatory requirements, it's not a specific regulatory requirement for your organization to have a risk management structure. So one thing I'll just mention, sometimes risk and internal controls get kind of bundled together, and it's important to make sure that they are definitely tied together, but with all the effort on Sarbanes-Oxley and some of the improvements with internal controls, it's important to make sure your internal controls program fits hand in hand with your risk management process. And it's also important to note at this point that internal controls should be applicable to a certain type of risk. So if you're testing all different types of internal controls and they're not associated back with a risk, you may want to take a look at revamping your internal controls program to ensure that the risks that you're worried about are being properly addressed through your internal controls program or initiative.